His explanation seems to me to be quite compelling, that he is essentially resisting a return to a failed strategy of containment and neglect, calling for, temporary pauses in the bombardment, but crucially, talking about what leadership is. I'll read you what he said. He said, "I wanted to be clear about where I stood and where I will stand. Leadership is about doing the right thing. That is the least the public deserves and the least that leadership demands," adding that every leader has a duty to forge a better and more secure future for both Palestinians and Israelis. And alongside leaders around the world, I have called throughout for adherence to international law, for humanitarian pauses to allow access for aid, food, water, utilities and medicine, and have expressed our concerns at the scale of civilian casualties. Much more needs to be done in this regard to ease the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Jess Phillips has walked away from her role as a shadow minister for domestic violence in protest at this position, or at least in determination to vote in favour of the ceasefire. Afzal Khan, Manchester Gorton, Naz Shah, Paula Barker, Sarah Owen, Rachel Hopkins, Andy Slaughter, MP for the constituency neighbouring mine in West London, have all also resigned their ministerial positions. In her letter, Yasmin Qureshi, the MP for Bolton South East, said the situation in Gaza desperately requires an immediate ceasefire to address the humanitarian catastrophe. Now, I just some thoughts on this. Are they arguing about words? So when Yasmin Qureshi calls for a humanitarian ceasefire and Keir Starmer calls for a humanitarian pause, are they really at odds with each other? So unless you think that a ceasefire now would be permanent, that Hamas would stop attacking Israelis, and Israel, in the event of Hamas attacking them, as Hamas has pledged they would continue to do, Israel would then retaliate, then I'm not dancing on the head of a pin here. It just strikes me that the difference between a humanitarian pause and a humanitarian ceasefire is semantic. Because as long as Hamas exists, then violence will continue in both directions. Hamas will attack Israel and Israel will retaliate. And as long as Israel exists, Hamas will attack Israel. So I don't believe the bit I find... Can I just stress something first as well before you start ringing in that you can hold conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. It doesn't make you dishonest or corrupt. You can desperately want a ceasefire, but also wonder whether calling for it is helpful. For a politician like Starmer, you can honestly believe that Israel haven't got a hope in hell of eradicating Hamas and that they're more likely to be radicalising future generations of terrorists and Israel haters by adopting this course of action, but you can't come up with a better one. Do you see what I mean? I don't want to have a binary conversation today. I want to have an intelligent and compassionate conversation. But I also want to talk about the position that Keir Starmer has taken, because he could call for a ceasefire 100 times a day and there wouldn't be one. So what is the role of a political leader at a time like this? I sense the vaguest sniff of opportunism in the air from some people. Very easy to vote against the whip or to decline the invitation of your leader, and it plays well perhaps in your constituency. But if you are a leader and you need to adopt a plausible and pragmatic position while bearing in mind throughout that politics is the art of the possible, Starmer hopes by this time next year or shortly afterwards to be sitting at the table where these issues, where the future of Gaza is thrashed out by world leaders. And if he arrives with slogans and slightly cynical posturing on his CV, I wonder whether he can be taken completely seriously. Can he sit down with whoever finally seeks to bring a two-state solution to this area? It's not going to be Benjamin Netanyahu, but can he sit down with them if he has called for Israel to stop responding to the October the 7th terror attack? So you see what I mean about having all sorts of don't be anti-semantic. There's a text at the top of my inbox which, in the tricky circumstances that we're navigating at the moment, brought a much-needed smile to my face, as indeed did Ben in Orpington's text, which says, "Thank you, James. I've been saying the same thing. OMG even, thank you, James." The difference is semantics all along. Steve in Glasgow disagrees. He says ceasefire means stop and talk, and pause means stop and start again. But I think that's what I disagree with, Steve. Because I don't think it's going to stop. I think any ceasefire will only be a pause as long as Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. I don't think that Hamas have a role to play in a two-state solution. And I don't think Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu's party in its current form, does either. That's something that gets slightly overlooked by much of the coverage. It's a chilling passage in a book Max Hastings wrote. I think it was a biography of Netanyahu's brother. And he quotes the young Benjamin Netanyahu in I don't want to misquote it or misrepresent it, but it would make pretty grim reading for any Israeli who believes that Netanyahu is committed to or likely to deliver peace or to deliver a two-state solution. So there are some of the conflicting thoughts that I have. I don't think that this will work in the context of eradicating Hamas, and I don't really think they do either. I think they just want to hobble Hamas so completely that the next bout of violence will be further off than it currently is. And I can't sit here and say that that is an ignoble aim, trying to ensure that the next bout of Hamas violence is much further off than it would currently be scheduled to be. But then how many Palestinian innocents have to die before that does become an ignoble aim? How many thousands more people have to die before anybody turns around and says it is a noble aim to either eradicate or cripple Hamas, but it is not an aim for which 10,000 lives are a price worth paying, or 20,000, or 30,000, or 500,000. So, the existential threat to Israel runs through this conversation, if you're honest, like Blackpool through a stick of rock, actions undertaken in almost unique historical circumstances, historical and geographical circumstances. Just think of those Holocaust survivors liberated from a death camp by a member of the Red Army who turned to a fellow Jew and said, "Where do we go now? Where do we go now?" in 1945. Where do we go now? That's Israel. That's the answer to that question, an answer that appeared on the map 3 years later in its current form. So you can't, I'm afraid, however much you might want to, you can't depart from that. But at the same time, how many deaths is too many deaths? And crucially, I think, is there really that much difference between a humanitarian ceasefire and a humanitarian pause if we agree, as we surely must, that whatever you call the cessation of attack, it will start again. That I think is why I want a ceasefire. I want a ceasefire. I want a bilateral ceasefire. I can call for a bilateral ceasefire knowing that really you're putting all the moral pressure on Israel because no one realistically expects Hamas to observe one. Okay? Not forever. I want a ceasefire. If I was leader of the Labour Party, I would struggle not to let my head be led by my heart. I want a ceasefire. I'd be a bit like Jess Phillips. I would call for a ceasefire. I'd resign my shadow ministry because I want to vote for a ceasefire. But if I put my heart in the back seat and focused on what my head was telling me, I think perhaps I'd be like Keir Starmer. What is the point of calling for something that isn't going to happen? What would it do to me as a leader to be allied with a slightly lazy-looking position, slightly, in terms of the semantics? And ultimately, what's the difference between a humanitarian pause in combat that we know will continue and calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in a battle, a bigger battle that we know will not be over?